All right, heroes, here we go. We are talking about Jewish denominations today. We have already got people in the chat who know what to do. That Kathy is here from California. Daniela Gulato is here saying, hope I had a blessed day. I am having a blessed day. It's a little bit early in the day, and I will say it is the morning after Erev Purim. So I celebrate Purim in a traditional fashion. I know I told people that you don't have to drink for Purim, but sometimes I do. And so I'm going to be hitting the coffee pretty hard today. So I'm not endorsing drunken behavior, but it is what it is. So it is 9 a.m. here in Southern California, 9:01 actually. So we're going to jump right into this live session. We see Drake here in the live chat. We see Vanessa from Germany. Teresa is here saying evening all. Teresa is here from Cyprus. We've got Ruthie and Daniela and Kathy and so many Jew-curious folks tuning in today to talk about Jewish denominations. This is a little bit off track from this week. So far this week, we've mostly talked about Purim, right? This is a holiday. Today is Purim, in fact. Today is the holiday of Purim. And last night we began Purim. I'll say we had a fantastic Purim spiel at Pasadena Jewish Temple and Center in beautiful Pasadena, and it was a Moana-themed Purim spiel. So we took the story of Esther, the story of that's portrayed in Megillat Esther, that's in the Ketuvim section of the Tanakh, the writings. But this scroll of Esther tells the story of the Jewish people in the Empire of Persia, a moment in that empire's history when there was a particular advisor to the king who wanted to perform a genocide on the Jewish people. And it turned out, nobody knew this, the queen was Jewish. So his timing could not have been worse. But what we do every year at this time of year, we celebrate the courage of that queen who apparently took that job, not telling anybody she was Jewish. Her original name was Hadassah, but in this story we call her Esther. Many people have kind of a Jewish name and a public name. And she hid her Jewish name until she had this choice to make of revealing her Jewish identity in order to save her people. And she did at great personal risk, but it worked out well for her, worked out well for us. And so every time at this year, we celebrate that fact with the holiday of Purim. So if I seem a little bit hungover, it's not for a bad reason. So in any case, really excited today to talk about Jewish denominations. This is a question that I get all the time. Rabbi, would you talk about the different denominations, how they are different from one another, where they came from? And I love teaching on this, as a matter of fact, because I'm kind of a genetic history buff. My father is a historian. And so a lot of times I look at Judaism not as a single fixed thing. It's always been the same. It will always be the same. But as this momentary snapshot of a long historical development. And the evolution of the denominations of Judaism is not different. This is a historical development that's happened over the last few hundred years in the context of a 3,000-4,000 year history of development and evolution of the Jewish people. And so I love talking about this because it gives me the opportunity to bust some myths about Jewish denominations. Before I bust too much, let's go back into the chat, see who is joining us. Once again, we've got Vanessa from Germany, Teresa from Cyprus, Ruthie is, I believe, from Florida. We've got Daniela from Perth, Western Australia. Really glad to see you here. Carla is from right here in SoCal, as is Kathy. And let's see, Val is from Florida as well. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming back. Drake, glad to see you, brother. So I'll ask the people in the chat to ask what questions you want about the different Jewish denominations while I'm talking, how this usually goes if this is your first time here. I've got a bit of a talk prepared. However, what I'm really excited about is the Q&A portion of this show. So ask what questions you have. We will get right into the nitty-gritty. I will answer whatever questions I can live. Sometimes I get stumped. Sometimes people ask me things that I don't know. I'm a rabbi. I've been studying Jewish stuff for a very long time now, but I have to be humble that I don't know everything. And sometimes I'll say, I'm going to look at that and get back to you. If you are watching this on the replay and you don't get a chance to ask your question in the chat, please feel free to put your questions in the comments below, in the comments section on YouTube to this video, and I will look into that, get back to you as soon and as well as I can. Once again, if this is your first time here watching one of my videos, you should know that I've got, pushing 200 videos on YouTube at this point about different Jewish things, about different Jewish words, different Jewish holidays, things like that. All week we've been talking about Purim. This is a bit of a departure. We're going to talk about Jewish history, not necessarily related to Purim today, but that's okay, because I think I said what I had to say about Purim, and people have asked the questions that they have. We're going to do something different today. Tomorrow, if you want to tune back in, we're going to be talking about the Parashat HaShavua, the weekly Torah portion, and this week's Torah portion is Tzav, if you're watching this close to the time that it comes out. So this is the second parasha of Sefer Vayikra, or the book of Leviticus, and we'll be talking about that on the Friday morning broadcast. So let's see. Right off the bat, we've got Ari from Arizona and also Larry from Arizona. Oh, I'm sorry, Ruthie. I'm thinking there's a couple of people I always mix up. So there's Ruthie is from Fullerton, not from Florida. Please, I beg your pardon. Larry is here also from Arizona and asked this great question: is there a difference between modern Orthodoxy in the U.S. and the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel? And the answer is yes and no. They both consider themselves part of Orthodoxy. They recognize each other as Orthodox Jews. However, there has been of late an increasing rift or schism between modern Orthodoxy in the U.S. and the Orthodox Chief Rabbinate of Israel. We'll get into that a little bit more in the talk. Let's see. We've got... Ari is saying it's hot here. It's already 87 this week. I am sorry. I have to express my apologies to anybody in the New York area. I've had the advantage of living in Southern California for going on 10 years now, and I was complaining earlier because it was like slightly raining yesterday, but then by the afternoon it was perfectly warm and like pool weather, which is good because my kids are on spring break right now. And so Ari says here on March the 21st, it's already 87 degrees in Arizona this time of day. So Ruthie's from SoCal, Kathy's from SoCal. What I love about this community that we're creating is we've got people from SoCal to NorCal, different place, not judging, perfectly nice things going on in the Bay Area, including my son and his fiance live up in the Bay Area. We've got Florida, we've got Cyprus in the Mediterranean region. We've got folks coming in from Germany, Australia. Many times we get students from Thailand, places like that. So really glad about this international community that we're building. So let's get into it. Ruthie says, I really want to learn the difference between conservative and reform. They seem so similar to me. Okay, excellent idea that we're going to play off. So, it's early in the morning here, and yes, I had a bit of a late night. So let's get right into the historical development. So I'll ask the question. He said rhetorically. I'll ask this question of people in the chat. What do you think? And I know there are many different movements of Judaism these days. Our talk, I should probably give it a little bit of a caveat. I'm a conservative rabbi. This is the movement that I feel most at home in. So I'm going to asterisk that, saying I may have some bias toward the conservative movement today. I ask you to bear with me. I'll try to be as equanimous as I can. However, I just wanted to put that right out front. I am a conservative rabbi. However, I'm also a student of all of history and of all the different forms of doing Jewish in the world. I have recently taught a graduate level class in the history of Jewish denominations. And so I learned a lot in teaching that I want to share with everybody here on YouTube today. So we're going to cover as many things as we can. I do have my own particular view on Judaism, but I want to suspend that as well as I can. But I wanted to be honest about my particular bias. So I'll ask the question, what do you think between the, let's say, three most populous denominations in the United States of America, Orthodox Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, which do you think is the oldest? Okay, go ahead and put your answers in the chat. And in the meantime, I will welcome Bionic Magi. You can call me Rachel or Rachel. I don't know if she's saying Rachel or Rachel. I'll say Rachel, just making an assessment. So Bionic Magi is here, a.k.a. Rachel. Omed Chazak 613. That is a very Jewish name for a YouTube handle because it's got the 613 in there, the number of commandments that we have in the Torah. Let's say in the UK, reform equals conservative and liberal equals reform. Thank you very much. Vanessa says, so I asked the question, what is the oldest of the Jewish denominations that are most present in the U.S. today? And I've got some smart people here. So maybe I'm spoiling the answer a little bit. Vanessa says reform. Ruthie says reform. Omar Khazak 613 says reform. Vanessa says reform, Orthodox, and conservative was last. So this is a smart bunch. Usually when I ask this question, among Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative, what do you think is the oldest? People say the Orthodox movement is the oldest, perhaps because Orthodox Jews tend to do Jewish in a more, let's say, traditional way. Ways that looked like Judaism a long time ago. However, what does Kathy say? Oldest is no denominations. Okay. Nigel says Orthodox. Daniel says Orthodox. So this is the modal answer that I get when I ask this question. Most people say Orthodox is oldest. Kathy says none of them. We're gonna negotiate this a little bit. Then why does Orthodox seem to be favored? Says Bionic Magi, a.k.a. Rachel. Ari said, I would think that Orthodox would be the oldest by definition. And so I'm going to go into a little bit of the history of the Jewish denominations. And this came from, Jewish people have been around for a super duper long time, y'all. We go back to the covenant between Avraham Avinu, Abraham, our ancestor, and God. This was sort of the first kind of Jewish conversation that happened. God says to a guy named Avram, I'm going to be your God, and you're going to be my Avram. How does that work out for you? And I would like you to leave where you are accustomed to and go to a place that I will show you. I know this is, kind of a long flashback, but here we go. And so we had this covenant with a particular person or a particular household, because I don't want to exclude his wife, Sarai, who had a big part to play in this. And then we had this arrangement with God for it with a particular family. Until we went into Egypt with Abraham's great-grandson Yosef welcomed us into Egypt when we were at a time of famine and we needed to be someplace else. And that went okay for a while until it didn't. And the Jewish population, or the Hebrew population, the word Jewish comes in way later, the Hebrew population of Egypt was enslaved. And then, again, I'm just sort of presaging Pesach or Passover for you. Passover is coming, y'all. Start cleaning your kitchens, I guess. But so anyway, we're in Egypt. We leave Egypt, and this covenant goes from a covenant with a family to a covenant with a people. Because in Egypt, let's say we increased our numbers quite a bit. And we leave Egypt, and by God redeeming us from Egypt, we create this new covenant, or this additional layer to the covenant with God, that it's no longer with a single family, like a nuclear family, but with a nation at this point. And then that nation journeys back to Canaan, settles the land, starting with the book of Joshua. And then we have about 1,000 years of history in there where we settle the land. Things go well, things go poorly. Parts of the land gets divided up. Some tribes disappear into the sands of time. And then we become, let's say, Jewish by virtue of part of the last population that remains after a particular exile and rift was the tribe of Yehuda. And then by then we have the Romans coming in calling us Judeans, because we were this was the people who were occupying the land of the tribe of Yehuda, and the Romans called us Judeans. They didn't have a J sound in Latin, and so we became the Yehudi, right, or the Judeans, or later German transliterations, the Judeans, and then it becomes Jews. And so, at that point, we are kind of one people, but kind of not. And I want to presage our discussion of modern denominations by saying that denominationalism, that is, dividing amongst ourselves into different groups, is not a new thing. We've been doing this throughout our history. We had different tribes. Some of those tribes disappeared. Then we had one or two tribes together. But then, let's say, by the time of the Romans, there were, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, 5 main denominations of Judaism. So this is kind of a long walk, but bear with me. In the time of, let's say, the years 100 BCE to 100 CE, after, CE meaning Common Era, after the year 0 by the secular calendar, there were 5 different denominations of Jewish people. We were Pharisees, we were Sadducees, there was a group of people known as the Zealots, there was a group of people known as the Essenes, and there was a group of people known as the Nazarites, right? And so these were Jewish denominations that were in existence about 2,000 years ago, in the time of Roman occupation of Judea. And so I say this to say that having Jews do Jewish different ways is not new. Just to spoil it a little bit, the different Jewish denominations that we're talking about today, none of them are more than about 200 years old. Okay, we may say that we have a tradition going back 3,000-4,000 years, but the modern ways of doing Jewish are relatively new in the glacial pace of Jewish time. But denominationalism is not new. Now, going back to these 5 groups, we've got the Pharisees, we've got the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Essenes, and the Nazarites. The Pharisees started with the first exile, the first Babylonian exile in, I want to say, about the 6th, 7th century before the Common Era. And once we lost the temple, once we couldn't do sacrifices, we were a little bit lost. Like, we didn't know how to do Jewish, because doing Jewish before that was about or involved a centralization of killing an animal in a building, right? We connected to God through sacrifices, and we're talking about that a lot in Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, right now. So the main way of doing Jewish was sacrificing animals in a temple. Right, there were other values associated with it as well, dietary laws, ethical laws, but worship was about this cult of a sacrificial system. And with the loss of the first temple, that disappeared. We couldn't do it anymore. In Babylonia, this group of teachers emerged who said, hey, we can't do sacrifices, let's do study and prayer instead until we get the temple again. And now those were what we call now the Pharisees. When we were able to go back, thank you, King Cyrus, who conquered Babylonia and said, all the Jews can go back to Jerusalem and rebuild your temple, restore your sacrificial system. And many did, and many did not. The Pharisees said, you know what? We kind of like this study and prayer thing. But the people who went back formed this group of people called the Sadducees, who said, okay, we've now restored temple worship in Jerusalem. We've restored the priestly line under the Sadducite priests. And so Sadducees comes from Sadukim, or the Sadducite line of priesthood. And these were the this was the Jewish denomination that was involved in sacrificing in the temple in the old school way. But anytime, and this is, I learned this from sociologist Peter Berger, and anytime you are trying to renew the old way of doing things, it's never exactly the same as the old way of doing things, right? It's this sort of nostalgic revival of the old ways, but with the knowledge and interface of the modernity of that time. Right, you can't go home again. Right, you can't unsee this cultural rift that created the system, or that smashed the system that you were used to. So it's always a revival of the old way, but through the lens of having encountered a different force. You've sort of lost your innocence in a way. So that's the Pharisees, the Sadducees. The Zealots were people who were, by and large, let's say, political Jews. They were really opposed to the Roman occupation and fought against it as hard as they could, zealously, one might say. There was a group of, let's say, spiritual Jews called the Essenes, and they left Jerusalem. They went out into the desert. They went out and occupied the area around the Dead Sea. Took a lot of our scripture and decided to preserve it in clay jars and bury it around the Dead Sea so that it wouldn't be lost. This is where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls from, was this spiritual commune offshoot group. These are like the hippies of our people from 2,000 years ago. One unique feature to the Essene way of doing Jewish community was they decided to be celibate. And so they would, they had spiritual communities, but they were not reproducing, right? Which may tip my hand as to why there are no Essenes around today. And finally, there were the Nazarites. There were a group of faithful Jews who, were studying the oral law at the time, immersed in a long-standing tradition that there would be a Moshiach coming, there would be a Messiah figure, that especially when you are in a hard time like Roman occupation, for example, you're really looking for that guy to show up, right? When things seem really bad, you're looking for somebody to come in and save you from those bad things. And the Nazarites believed that they found that guy. They believed that a person had come who represented that Moshiach figure that we've been talking about. And so then, we had difficulty with our Roman overlords. We lost the Second Temple in the year about 70 of the Common Era. We continued to stay in the land. The Zealots fought against them. The problem with zealotry is when you go up against the Roman Empire, they don't like leaving survivors. And so the Zealots were gone. When the Second Temple was destroyed, the people who were most occupied in building and supporting and maintaining the temple service were kind of out of business. So there go to the Sadducees, right? The Essenes, as we said before, great ideas, buried a lot of scrolls, and thank God because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls today and early examples of our literature preserved. But if you're not having kids, then you're not going to be around for much longer, which leaves the Pharisees and the Nazarites. And so, the Pharisees continued practicing Judaism through study and prayer and observance of the mitzvot, and so they have stuck around for quite a bit. That is what's now called Rabbinic Judaism, and by and large, most Jews, as such, don't observe, let's say, biblical Judaism, but they observe Rabbinic Judaism. And this is the tradition of the Pharisees. And then you have the Nazarites, this group of Jews that then later expanded to non-Jews, who believed that they found this Mashiach figure and followed him. There's like 1 billion and change of them right now, whereas there's only about 15 million of the, let's say, genetic and cultural and intellectual descendants of the Pharisees, and that's what Judaism is today. So that was a lot of history about previous Jewish denominations. Just to say that denominationalism, divisions among Jews based on ideology, based on socioeconomic factors, has always been with us. Let's fast forward to the early 19th century in Germany. There was, in the interim time, there were always, Jewish communities in the diaspora, many of them spread around Europe, as well as other places, but we're going to focus on the Jews that spread around sort of Western, Eastern, Central, Northern Europe, the Ashkenazi population, let's say. And what was going on outside of the Jewish world? I'll back up. Inside the Jewish world, we were largely sort of an itinerant people. We could settle places, but we couldn't own land. We weren't considered citizens of whatever nation that we were a part of. We were always kind of treated differently. In many places in Europe, we were ghettoized into particular neighborhoods that we were allowed to live in, but we weren't allowed to live in other neighborhoods. We didn't have all the rights and privileges of citizens of those countries. Until we see in the late 18th century, early 19th century, this movement of nationalism in Europe, right? All the countries that we think of in Europe being these, the old country, as it were, these places of long standing, most of their political boundaries, as we see them today, didn't exist before the 19th century. France is probably the oldest of these countries in terms of they established the Republic of France at the very end of the 18th century. And they were motivated by ideals of saying, okay, we have all these little principalities. Let's bring them together under the rubric of we have a common history, we have a common language, we have a common religion. Let's create a nation based on that. So we're no longer divided by all these little principalities and kingdoms and fiefdoms and things like that. And so all of the territories that spoke French became France. This happened as well in Germany, what was sort of the Prussian Empire, as it were. All these people kind of bound together into one nation of Germany. Likewise happened in Italy and other places like that. But what came along with that was what Jewish historians call emancipation, meaning when these nations formed, they made the decision that everybody within their boundaries was a citizen of that nation. And especially this was true in Germany, where everybody within the bounds of what was Germany, was considered a German citizen, and including us. For most of the history of Jews in Europe, we couldn't own property. We couldn't join artisanal guilds. Like we couldn't practice a trade. Not owning property meaning we couldn't farm and sustain ourselves through our ownership of our own land. We may have been taxed, but we didn't have full privilege under that taxation. But the decision was that, okay, everybody here is a German citizen, even the Jews. Right? And you don't have to live in those ghettos anymore. We're still going to draft you for the military. We are going to tax you, but you are going to get all the rights and privileges of a German citizen. And this is what we call the emancipation. Jews were freed from their second-class citizenship. The cultural biases, still persisted. However, legally, we could be just as German as everybody else in Germany. And what happened was many Jews took advantage of this. Right? I get to leave the ghetto. I get to go to the same universities as everybody else. I get to apply the same trade, fill the same occupations. I get to be not just Jewish, but German and Jewish at the same time. And in the early part of the 19th century, the leaders of the Jewish community were seeing that Jews were largely disappearing into German society. There was this vast wave of assimilation. Now that I'm no longer trapped in the ghetto, I want to be like everybody else around here. And not that this is like an unnatural or bad move. This happened in the time of Shmuel in the book of Samuel, where the Jews looked around and said, hey, we're getting attacked on all sides. Wouldn't it be great if we had a king just like everybody else? Like we've always wanted to be just like everybody else in terms of the rights that we have and the rights to self-determination and self-defense and things like that. So even, things that were playing out in the books of Samuel, playing out again in Germany in the 19th century. So what happened was the lay leaders of the community, the rabbis of the community were saying, like, look, the young people, and not just the young people, aren't doing Jewish the way they used to do Jewish. Right? They want to be citizens. They want to not just speak Yiddish, but speak German. They want to associate with their Christian German colleagues, and traditional observation, traditional observance of Jewish practices, many people felt got in the way of that. And so they said, well, what if we take a page out of Martin Luther's book? And we don't take that page lightly, because Martin Luther, in addition to kicking off the Protestant Reformation a couple hundred years before that, was a notorious anti-Semite, no friend of the Jews. However, he, within Christianity, said, okay, let's take the faith and put it back in the hands of the people instead of just the hands of the leader. Let's translate the Bible into the vernacular German. And Judaism has never been about having a pope or secrets or this like secret society governing our religion. So it was natural to say, hey, let's take the Torah and translate it into German. Let's have rabbis give sermons, not in Hebrew or Yiddish, but in German. Right? Let's make this religion accessible and practicable for people who are no longer living in isolation within Jewish communities. Let's reform Judaism in this way. And so among the major denominations that we see in the world today, the oldest is the Reform movement, because these were people who were traditional Jews who said, okay, we are losing people to modernity. Let's reform Judaism so that people feel comfortable being both Jewish and German. They no longer have to choose between one or the other. And I point this out because often there is a bias of non-Reformed Jews against Reformed Judaism, saying that it is a kind of assimilationist Judaism, and I reject that altogether, because it wasn't an assimilationist move, it was an anti-assimilationist move. People were assimilating anyway, and they said, let us reform Judaism in such a way that we stem assimilation. That people who wanted to associate with their non-Jewish countrymen, neighbors, friends, what have you, could still practice Judaism in a way that didn't separate them from everybody else in their newfound status of being German citizens. And so the Reform movement comes about from there. And again, I am not a Reform rabbi. I've studied some of the history from the outside. Probably there are people who could clarify a few of those things for me, but that's my best read on it at this point. And the thing is, in my study of history, anytime there is a revolution, there is a counter-revolution, right? Going back to the French Revolution, there were counter-revolutionists there as well. And so the counter-revolution of the Reform movement was Orthodoxy. But I hesitate because they didn't call themselves Orthodox. That was a label that was put on them by the Reformed Jews, right? These are people who were saying, you're going too far, you're making too many changes, let's go back to the old way of doing things. However, as we talked about with the Sadducees, anytime a people or a movement bump up against big changes in society, there are going to be people who go along with the changes, and there are going to be people who reject the changes from whole cloth. But they're rejecting the changes from a place of having seen them, right? Once you see modernity, you cannot unsee modernity. Right? And your going back to doing it the old way isn't identical to the old way, right? Sometimes it's even more extreme, right? That nostalgia just plays out in bigger circles than maybe you intended. And so so what was now called the Orthodox movement, those people who were called Orthodox, like you're sort of toeing the line, but you're being even more strict about things than we were before in order to preserve the authenticity of Jewish practice. But this Orthodox movement was a reaction to the Reform movement, and they said, okay, to battle what the Reform movement is doing, we are going to be even more strict in our practice, more strict of what we recognize as Jewish than we were back in the ghetto when we were all kind of doing the same thing. And so I say that to say that Orthodoxy is not the same as the Judaism that had been practiced before the encounter with modernity in Germany in the 19th century, right? It is in many ways more conservative than things were before. And I say conservative, that's small c conservative, because I'm kind of a fan, and people may argue with me about this, I'm kind of a fan of the work of Hegel. It was another German scholar, not Jewish, I don't think, but he observed trends in history as having, let's say, a thesis and an antithesis and a synthesis, right? So when change happens, that change is a thesis. Here's our thesis about a new way of doing things. And every thesis inspires an antithesis, meaning, okay, here's a new way of doing things. Here is a rejection of that new way. And then there is a synthesis of, let's say, okay, well, maybe we can balance the goods of these two things. And so there was a group of people, and it wasn't called conservative back then. They were intellectuals and scholars in what was then called the positive historical movement or school of philosophy, saying, look, we are citizens of Germany. We are practitioners of modernity. We embrace this change, this elevated status of the Jewish people, but we're not ready to let go of everything that we see our Reform colleagues letting go of. We are not as strictly against benefiting from modernity as our Orthodox colleagues seem to be. Let's try to balance these two things. And so, and in that, they also recognize philosophically that it had always been thus. Within Judaism, you have always had extremes. You have always had dialogue and change. And, there was no, it's always been this. There are factions within the Orthodox world that saying, okay, the way I'm doing Jewish is the exact same way that Moses did Jewish at Mount Sinai. And the positive historical scholars recognize, that's not true. Times have changed. People have changed. We've spread out across the world. We've always been evolving, synthesizing things from the world around us, incorporating it into Judaism and making it Jewish and doing it in a Jewish way. And so these positive historical scholars, leaders, Jews, recognized we can have an evolving way of doing Jewish that doesn't reject as much of tradition as the reformers had set aside, that doesn't require a kind of insularity that our Orthodox neighbors are saying we need in order to maintain the integrity of the Jewish project. They were just kind of the middle of the road people, right? And wasn't really called conservative mostly until we came to America. What else is going on during this time is a mass migration of Jewish people to the United States. Right. Even though we had German citizenship, it wasn't necessarily the most fun place in the world to be Jewish. Right. We had rights recognized, but there were still cultural biases against Jews. There was a mass migration in the middle of the 19th century of German Jews to America. And there were Jews in America already. I think one of the oldest Jewish communities is from the late 1600s. Right? But a large part of the Jewish movement to America happened in the middle of the 19th century, and they were largely German Jews, largely Reform Jews, who settled in the United States. And I'm wearing Levi Strauss jeans right now. You can't see it on the camera, but I wouldn't be wearing Levi Strauss jeans if it weren't for this settlement of Jews who came to America and expanded westward with the Western expansion and decided, okay, all these minor 49ers in San Francisco need sturdy pants to wear. And so jeans were invented, and I'm wearing some right now. So in a sense, we have this large movement to America. So a lot of the Reform movement, it didn't really hang around in Germany so much, but mostly was exported to the United States. As were the different scholars and things like that thinking about Reform Judaism, and some Orthodox Jews as well. So everybody's moving to the U.S. because it's still not friendly for Jews in Europe, especially not in Russia and Eastern Europe in the Pale of Settlement. And there was another mass migration of Jews from Russia, Poland, Lithuania, that whole part of the world, because they were being chased out by pogroms, which were sort of, anti-Jewish riots and things like that, wiping out villages, chasing people away, excessive taxation, non-recognition of citizenship. And so there was another mass migration of Eastern European Jews to the U.S., and we'll say the period of like 1880 to 1920. And so we have one group of German Jews in America. We have one group of Eastern European Jews coming a little bit later into America. And in the late 19th century, there were Jews in America who were thinking, we have a lot of people coming from places where the practice was most akin to Orthodoxy, but they are trying to settle in America. They are trying to integrate into the American population. So what if we train rabbis here in the United States who have American university educations, but also have traditional Jewish learning, who can help this mass of people from Eastern Europe assimilate into American culture and assimilate, get jobs, start businesses, feel like American citizens. However, we are going to learn and teach traditional Jewish ways of doing things, and these are going to be the rabbis that we give to this population. That was the genesis of the Jewish Theological Seminary, right? The first conservative Jewish institution and seminary training rabbis in the U.S. in, let's say, the late 1800s. Meanwhile, there were plenty of Orthodox settlements here in the U.S. They were by and large not training their own rabbis here, but importing them from Europe. They're looking for the old way of doing things. And so they're bringing in rabbis from Europe into America. I'll say of the Jewish population today, this is a rough estimate. There's about 15 to 20 million Jews, depending on who you ask. It's like 15, 16 million Jewish people, plus there's a lot of people married to Jewish people or people associated with the Jewish community, which gives us about 20 million. Of the Jewish population in the world, approximately 40% lives in Israel, approximately 40% lives in the United States, and the remaining 20% is sort of scattered around various places: the UK, South Africa, Australia, Asia, South America. But the Jewish population in the United States, I think it might have changed. I think recently maybe Israel edged out the United States. But all of these denominations that we're talking about, by and large, grew up, if not were, toddlers, in the U.S. And it was in the United States that we encountered this favorability toward denominationalism. Christianity was going through a lot of the same stuff that we were, and it was in the United States where we had free exercise of religion, thank you, Constitution, that different communities could do things different ways without having impositions from the state. And so denominational diversity flourished in the U.S., right? Reform Jews could do the Reform thing. Conservative Jews could do the conservative thing. Orthodox Jews could do the Orthodox thing. We don't have state funding or support for any one particular denomination, which is hard when you're trying to pay the bills. However, it meant that we could have this diversity within the U.S. And so a couple of things that I want to reinforce. Divisions among Jews are not new. Right? Just read the Talmud, right? That kind of gives rise to the statement, if you have two Jews, you have at least three opinions, to which Rabbi Dorff recently related, what makes you think it takes two Jews to have multiple opinions? So that happens. America has been a rich earth for that to grow out of. In Israel today, and somebody was asking me, or I think it was Larry asking me earlier about the difference between Orthodoxy in America and Orthodoxy in Israel. The main difference is that Orthodoxy in America is, let's say, self-sustaining, whereas Orthodoxy in Israel has state sponsorship. This is a function of the, coalition-based government in Israel. There is a much wider diversity of political parties in Israel than there are today, and the prime minister is picked not by, the plurality coalition because there's so many people, nobody gets the majority. But certain parties will merge together, get enough votes to have a majority coalition, and that majority coalition, maybe at the leadership of the plurality leading party, will have a prime minister. But in order to be prime minister, you have to put together coalitions of very diverse peoples. How that has played out for Jewish denominationalism is that in order to build a coalition to access power, within that coalition are groups of extreme religious position. And so the coalition that survives today and is in power in Israel is a coalition built with the help of Orthodox Jews, some would say Haredi Jews. I don't like to use the word ultra-Orthodox, but it plays out. And so many people with, I'll say, minority fundamentalist opinions have gained outsized power in Israel to the point that the chief rabbinate or the rabbinut of Israel, or the chief rabbinate of Israel, is dominated by these fundamentalist Orthodox and then some views of the right way to do Judaism, until this has become de facto the state religion of Israel, right? What is in America approximately 10% of the Jewish population, in Israel is totally dominant to the point that they get to set the rules as to who is Jewish, who can get married, who can get buried, who has access to Jewish resources, where Orthodox institutions are funded by the state, but Reform, Conservative, and other Jewish denominations are not. And it's very hard to compete in that marketplace. It's very hard to put forth your way of doing Judaism where somebody else is getting subsidized by the government to do it their way. And so the folks who say, this is the way it's done, this is the only way it's done, this is the way it has always been done, have an outsized voice in Israel. And I hope I have demonstrated or given you the idea that there is no one way of doing Jewish that has always been done. And so I respect that every single religious community has their fundamentalists. My Christian family do. The Muslim community does. The Jews are no different in this regard. And so I hope I've given you a bit of an overview, kind of a meandering thing, kind of a sweeping thing, as to where the different Jewish denominations came from. We've been going for almost 50 minutes now, so I want to jump into the chat to answer specific questions. So let's go back. Just a little pause, take a sip of the rocket fuel. So we'll go back to the beginning. Bionic Magi says, then why does Orthodox seem to be favored? The question is sort of, favored by whom? Ari says, I would think that Orthodox would be oldest by definition. So the Orthodox movement tends to, let's say, by and large, meaning not just the leaders, but the members of that community as well, do more mitzvot in the traditional way of doing mitzvot, right? And that is, we've got this list of commandments. There's 613. You can't follow all of those because some of those are about farmers in Israel, and some of those you can only do if you have a temple. But of the traditional practices of doing Judaism, the Orthodox movement, the adherents to the Orthodox movement are by and large doing more of those traditional practices. So I'm not going to argue that it seems to be a more halachic movement, meaning a movement that follows Jewish law. I'm all for it. We have the Orthodox movement is responsible for preserving texts, for translating Jewish sources into English. The Art Scroll entity, I'm not sure if it's a company or what, publishing house, Art Scroll has preserved and translated a vast amount of Jewish texts. The Orthodox movement is largely responsible for kashrut worldwide, as a method of ensuring that food that's produced that we consume meets kosher standards, right? The Orthodox movement has been responsible for that, and I am super duper grateful that I get to read Jewish books, or I was able to read Jewish books while I was still learning Hebrew because of the availability of texts translated into English by the Orthodox movement, as well as I can get kosher food today because of the punctiliousness of Orthodox supervisors of food production. So please don't think I'm knocking it. That's not my goal at all. What I am interested in busting, though, is the myth that Orthodoxy is somehow, let's say, more Jewish than Reform Judaism is Jewish. And so many times, and this is true in conservative communities and Reform communities as well, that when I go and we talk about denominations, and I ask, like, what do you think about these different denominations? Like, how do you think of them? And people say, well, I'm Reform. Orthodox Jews are more Jewish than me, right? I'm not that Jewish. I'm just a Reform Jew. And that breaks my heart to hear that, in the sense that we have this kind of scale of what is more or less authentically Jewish that creates this kind of inferiority complex among Jews who aren't Orthodox. And again, if you practice Orthodox Judaism, I am all for it. I have Orthodox teachers, I have Orthodox colleagues, and I see that as a meaningful way of doing your life. I happen to, let's say, and somebody asked this, why am I a conservative Jew? This is where I came in, right? I married a woman who was raised as a conservative Jew. And so that was my entry point. When I went to seminary, the rabbis at the seminary pushed me actually before in the admissions process. They said, are you sure you're a conservative Jew? You've only ever studied conservative. Like, how do you know the things that you don't know? Like, how do you know that you may not be a Reformed Jew or an Orthodox Jew? And so I went back to the drawing board, studied as much as I can about the different denominations and their philosophies, and decided that, in fact, I felt most at home, not just personally and in terms of my family, but theologically and philosophically as well within the conservative movement. I don't know where they picked up that name. Somebody asked, like, why is it called conservative? It's terrible marketing. By the way, there's a lot of confusion there. There's also a bias and a bit of a myth, actually, that Jews are by and large politically liberal. That has been true in certain elections and on certain topics and things like that. But I'm seeing more and more Jewish people who are staunchly proud liberal Jews, in the sense that they are conservative or Reform, but have what we would call small c conservative political views. So that at some point we picked that. This was before we had names like conservative and liberal for how we do politics. The conservative Jews picked that name before there were, the Rush Limbaughs of the world, before there was a conservative movement in politics. And we picked poorly, I'll put it that way, because not because I have anything against people who are politically conservative, but because it's not a good descriptor and it kind of confuses people. We were conservative in comparison to Reform Jews. We were conserving certain traditions that had fallen into desuetude. Not because the Reform Jews are less serious about being Jewish. They just have a different philosophy, saying we have access to all of our tradition. We can teach and learn all of our tradition. However, what you follow personally is your decision based on learning what's out there and then deciding for yourself what is the right mitzvah for you to do, or set of mitzvot. Right? I think one of the watchwords is choice through education. Right? We have access to the same tradition, but people make choices based on what they learn about those traditions, versus we have access to this tradition. We are going to assume responsibility for the entire portfolio of mitzvot. And the conservative movement said, like, look, we have access to tradition. We have a tendency toward halachic, or legal-based Judaism. However, we see Judaism as an evolving thing, and has always been thus. I mean, we wouldn't have had the Pharisees if there hadn't been some people who zagged when everybody else was zigging, right? And without the Pharisees, we wouldn't have Judaism today. And so for me, the conservative movement, this is kind of like why I picked the conservative movement, is the movement that, this is my bias, I know, This is the movement that most accurately reflects and embraces the historical reality of the Jewish people, is that yes, we have respect for Torah, yes, we have respect for law, and when times change, we see those changes through the lens of the law, and we make decisions that will preserve the integrity of our people without sacrificing either modernity or the tradition. And so, but what I really want to break down and squash as much as I can. Sorry to be all squashy on you, but what I want to squash is this internal idea that people have that Reform is less Jewish, Orthodox is more Jewish, and conservatism is just sort of this squishy middle of the road. What's interesting about the conservative movement is the middle of the road is actually the widest part of the road. You have more diversity of opinion and observance and things like that within the conservative movement than you have in either Orthodoxy or Reform. Reform is very Orthodox in some ways. Like there are some principles that they hold onto very dearly, just as much as the Orthodox movement does. And within the conservative movement, it's much more decentralized. There's a lot more diversity of opinion, a lot more diversity of practice, which is hard to hang your hat on sometimes. Like, do I drive or do I not drive? Do I eat shrimp or do I not eat shrimp? Most of all, I'll say, drive if you have to, don't eat shrimp. So want to jump back into the questions. Why does Orthodoxy seem to be favored? Again, I think it's just this bias to say, there is a natural human bias toward nostalgia. This thing of, when times make me feel insecure, I feel more secure by going back to the old way of doing things. And so when I see people doing things in the old way, I have this romantic notion that is somehow more stable and more real and more authentic than what I'm doing now. What I'm trying to pass along is this same observation of religious sociologist Peter Berger, who says that old way of doing things that we observe in the world today is not exactly like the old way of doing things. And to the extent that people say, yes, it's always been this way, they are fooling you. And I'm not knocking it. Orthodox Judaism is a great way to live your life. And I know people are very happy in that way of living your life. But if that's not your way of doing Jewish, my strong encouragement to you is do not feel like you are less than for not doing that. And there are people who would make you feel less than for doing Jewish your way instead of their way. And that's true from any denominational perspective. So my goal here is to help people feel good about the Judaism that draws them, right, that works for them, and not feel like you are somehow inferior to another group or sect or what have you. So Daniel says, don't look at my kitchen, Rabbi. Okay, don't look at my kitchen either. That's why I have it focused on my bookshelf. So somebody else says, bless their hearts. How is modern Orthodox different from traditional Orthodox? And so sometime, and I'll say this is more of a 20th century phenomenon, this notion of modern Orthodoxy emerged. And this was Orthodox people who were, embracing living in a modern world. It's largely an American phenomenon, saying like, look, I can work on Wall Street. I can work, I could be a lawyer. I could also do all sorts of things with my non-Jewish countrymen, and yet still practice my orthodoxy. And so what we would call modern orthodoxy today is much less insular in the sense of the kind of jobs you take, the kind of schools you go to. You can go to a regular university without your parents worrying too much about you being exposed to crazy modern and specifically non-Jewish ideas. You could live in the world and maintain your orthodoxy. Versus, I don't really know how to treat the phrase traditional Orthodox because, as I hope I've displayed today, it's less traditional than you think it is. However, I think for me, the difference is how comfortable you feel leaving the Jewish world for a little bit. Maybe it's your workday, maybe it's your college education. Can you maintain your Orthodox way of doing things without sequestering yourself into exclusively Jewish communities? That's a big difference between, let's say, modern Orthodoxy and the Haredi movement. The word Haredi, when we use the word ultra-Orthodox, which again I hate because I think, again, it's using that spectrum of more or less Jewish. The more accurate technical term is Haredi. This is a movement within Orthodox Judaism, largely originated in the beginning of the 20th century, that said those people who are calling themselves modern Orthodox, they're integrating more with this dangerous outside world, are losing their Jewishness. And so we, the Haredi, and the word Haredi, Haredim, comes from, it means those who tremble. Right, Hasidic Hasid means a pious one. A Haredi is a one who trembles, meaning the Yirat Shamayim causes one to, I'm so fervent in my service, awe, fear of God that I literally tremble. And so that's where the word Haredi comes from. And again, the Haredi community teaches that this is the way that Judaism has always been done, and we're the only ones doing it. We're the ones who are trembling before God when everybody else is assimilating. However, the word Haredi doesn't appear anywhere in Jewish literature, press, what have you, until the early part of the 20th century. And so the more exclusively authentic people claim to be, my opinion, my studied observation is that the less historically accurate that's going to be. And so I hope that answers some questions. So there are within every, and I want to say within every movement there are shades. There is a spectrum. I hesitate to other than explaining the history of the Reform movement, I hesitate to describe or certainly not criticize the Reform movement in any specific way, because that would be too broad a brush. I know Reform Jews who are very serious about practicing mitzvot. I also know Reform Jews who are very serious about exercising their choice not to practice mitzvot that aren't meaningful for them in their lives. And so there's a wide spectrum of, let's say, doing Jewish within the Reform movement, as in the conservative movement, as in the Orthodox movement. So within Orthodoxy itself, there are modern Orthodox. There are Haredi, right? There's people in the middle of that who are comfortable in both worlds, who maybe raise kids who become one or the other. There is a new trend that I've seen called open Orthodoxy, where people are acknowledging, like, I can be Orthodox, but that doesn't mean that I only talk to Orthodox Jews, right? Or I only associate it with Orthodox communities. And this has to do with American individualism. That's sort of the ground that generally religious denominationalism in America grew out of, was this embrace of the authority of the individual, which is kind of a not very Jewish idea, but it's a very American idea. So people say, I can be a conservative Jew, and my brother or sister can be a Reform Jew, or my brother and sister could be an Orthodox Jew, and we're all in the same family. And that historically hasn't been true within Jewish communities, but it has always been true in American communities. And so all of this denominational diversity comes from the kind of rugged individualism of the American character and the staunch preservation of people's rights to choose things. And so within America, you have Haredi Jews, you have modern Orthodox Jews, you have open Orthodox Jews, and everything in between. Right, and I was interviewing somebody on the podcast where a lot of Haredi Jews or people who sort of identify Hasidic from one of these sort of part of the Hasidic movement of Eastern Europe of the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, who vote very differently than many of their compatriots vote or associate with the non-Jewish world in very different ways. And so when we talk about denominationalism, we're talking about silos that are very porous, right? There's not, one way to be a Reformed Jew, one way to be a conservative Jew, one way to be an Orthodox Jew. There are people in each of those camps who will disagree with that statement. But within each of them, they have a broad spectrum of opinion and way of doing Jewish. These are convenient categories, as part of denominationalism has to do with constructing institutions that preserve those boundaries over the 20th century. Those boundaries are starting to break down with, again, more access to information and individual choice, and people are going in all sorts of different directions. So that might be kind of confusing, but I wanted to give you the real talk instead of saying this is always this, that's always that, this over here has always been that and will always be. Because each of these things is changing. What prompted my interest in this was maybe a year or two ago, there was an article in the Jewish Forward, which is a newspaper. It started as a newspaper. It was a Yiddish newspaper maybe 100 years ago. It now has a lot of presence on Facebook. So the Jewish Forward newspaper did a roundtable discussion. They asked a bunch of different rabbis, what do you think is the biggest threat to the Jewish world today? Right. So they asked, I forget, it was like 7, 8, 10 different rabbis, what's the biggest threat facing the Jewish world? And everybody had a different opinion, whether it's assimilation or intermarriage or anti-Semitism or apathy or boredom or what have you. What would make the Jewish world shrink or cease to exist? What are the existential crises facing Judaism? And their answers were less interesting to me than the diversity of the rabbis themselves, knowing that no single denomination represented was more than 200 years old, which in Jewish time is like that. Right? This is an eye blink in Jewish history. This great diversity that's a beautiful thing, but is also causing a lot of friction and struggle and fighting between Jews. This is a new phenomenon. So you're asking the question, what are the existential threats facing Judaism, to a bunch of rabbis representing denominations, all of which are fairly recent responses to their time's existential threats. So the existential threat to Judaism, with the wonderful event of emancipation, when we were no longer second-class citizens, that was a good thing, right? That we were allowed to be citizens in the nation that we lived in was unheard of in Europe at that time. So this was a good thing for the Jews, but this kind of freedom represented an existential crisis to traditional ways of observing Judaism. And each of the denominations present were a response in that time to how do we keep doing Jewish? How do we keep our kids and our grandkids doing Jewish in a way that we don't disappear into the wilderness of freedom? And some people said we're going to reform. Some people said we were going to hold the line, but even be more strict than the line was before. And some people fell out in the middle, and a whole spectrum within those movements. And so I always tell this story. I think we're going to be fine. Right? I don't want to scare anybody. I told the story in my podcast when I interviewed Brad Hirschfield of these two seders that I went to. One seder, it was same Passover, 2 different nights. One seder I went to, this one young man at the seder said, Judaism is done. We're going to disappear. And the reason I know this is because right after this seder, I'm going to go drink some beer and eat bacon. Right. One thing that's that's not in keeping with the dietary laws. One thing is something we don't do on Passover, which is drink beer. But there are those who do. And he said, because I feel free to do this, I don't see how Judaism could last. And the next night I went to a different seder where adults with people with adult children who had already, made their way in the world, were saying that, they raised their kids as religious Jews, and these kids got even more religious when they went to college, and then afterwards they moved to Israel and they became Orthodox, and then now when they come back, they won't eat in their parents' house anymore because their kashrut isn't up to their standards. Right? So we have one kid who says Judaism is over because he feels free to practice other things. And we have one group of families who says, our kids are so extremely dedicated to mitzvot that it's affecting our family integrity. And I feel between these two poles, we're going to be okay. As long as we can keep in this kind of open dialogue, as long as we can look at history objectively and realistically, and understand that we have to negotiate these values that we have, the communities that we want to belong to, the mitzvot that give our lives meaning. And why I'm a conservative Jew is because I believe, and this is just me, I believe that philosophically the conservative movement has been the most objective in recognizing realities and yet holding on to these poles of living in the world and doing what God wants of us. And that's where I've kind of fallen out. I'm not selling it to you. I like it quite a bit, but you do you. So let's see if there are any questions. This is a big topic. So Rachel Brazil asks, switching accounts so I don't have to be called by my handle every time. Thank you very much. Sorry for calling you by your handle. Vanessa says, I heard an Orthodox rabbi on YouTube call the Reform movement the deform movement rather than the Reform and conservative Jews fake Jews. I was shocked to hear this. Is the tension from all angles? I'll say yes. I mean, I think just by my observation and maybe my own occasional Yetzer Hara, we tend to pick sides, and when we pick sides, we pick fights. And I'll say personally, it disgusts me, when Orthodox leaders denigrate or deny the Jewishness of other Jews in the world. I think it's disgusting. I think it's not for. I think if they had any kind of humility that goes along with their learning, they can say like, "I'm Orthodox. I believe this. I practice this. I teach this. I encourage other people to do this." But denigrating the Jewishness of other Jews is really not what we need right now. The rabbis of the Talmud would have. Some of them would have succumbed to the same bias, but most of them would have rejected this kind of division as well. And I think that deformed Jews and fake Jews. Like, really, we're 0.5% of the world population. We need to pick fights right now. That just seems like a kind of bias and insularism and the I'll say the deformity of thought. I hate to bring that word back in, but to denigrate people and make fun of them, to reject their Jewish identity, is not in keeping with, let's say, the wise and kind Orthodox rabbis that I have learned from. Kathy asks, regarding assimilation of my 5 good friends who were Jewish, only one kept her religion. That happens. Judaism has always been in kind of tension between the people and the religion. And there are people who feel proudly Jewish but don't necessarily cotton to the religious practice. And that's been true since the time of the Talmud and before as well. We wouldn't have most of the Torah if Moses wasn't fighting with people. People say, I don't want to do that, or that's too hard. That's like most of the back four books of the Torah right there. We've always had this kind of division, and some people stick to it, some people don't. We have a lot of viable alternatives for finding meaning, especially in the United States of America, where people find other ways of scratching that itch of, how do I solve the problem of evil? What happens to my soul after I die? How can I have meaningful relationships in the world today? For many people, Judaism offers answers to that. And for many people, they say, I'm going to go seek my answers elsewhere. A bowl of salad, that's a handle here. I was raised modern Orthodox. My mom was a convert from Korea to marry my father. My rabbi says that the biggest existential threat to the generation not recognizing their culture. And I'm not going to necessarily disagree with that. I'm not going to go say that I don't think that's the biggest threat necessarily. But people should learn their culture, and Jews should learn their culture. But I'm not going to say they should learn one way of doing Jewish culture. I think that's the impetus behind a lot of, let's say, Orthodox outreach. What I learned from my talk with Jack Wertheimer is there are more Orthodox outreach professionals than there are non-Orthodox rabbis. And so, not for nothing, within the world of Jewish thought and Jewish association, there are way more people pushing this idea that Orthodox Judaism is the only way of doing Jewish than there are people who will stand up and say no. And I'm going to get a little bit of a tear here. If you go to YouTube, just front page YouTube, type in the word rabbi. After the video, you should hang out so we can talk, because I'm having a lot of fun with you guys. Type in the word rabbi and see the faces who show up. I'm going to say 90% of the faces who show up when you type in rabbi on YouTube or on Google image search are dudes with beards. Right? Specifically male, specifically bearded, specifically dressed or teaching a type of Judaism that is a slim minority of Jewish opinion in the world today, and a slim minority of Jewish opinion in the Jewish world historically, representing themselves as the only authentic way to do Judaism. This erases, first off, it erases all the women I know who are rabbis. This erases the majority of American Jews who do not adhere to that philosophy. And it's only true because this group of people are super good at digital media, right? They've been making the video because they're working the hardest for outreach. They've been making the most videos, and that's what you see when you get Google image search. A rabbi is a dude with a beard. And that's not necessarily true. I'm a dude. I don't have a beard because my wife doesn't like how I look with a beard. So I shave every day with an electric razor, which Orthodox authorities say does not violate the don't cut the corners of your beard thing. There are Orthodox Jews who use electric razors or depilatories or whatever. So I'm a Jew. I like following Jewish law as much as I can, but I don't look like that. And so I'm sorry, I'm just getting a little bit enraged that okay, there's more to Jewish culture than this one particular Jewish culture. If that is your culture, share it with people, show people what you love, that's fine. But you don't get to say that Reformed Jews sitting around having a Seder on Passover are not Jewish people having a Seder on Passover, right? You can get to claim your thing. You don't get to erase anybody else. That's just my philosophy. So that's why I show up and teach, and why I'm encouraging other rabbis to get on digital media so that we can see more of the real diversity of the Jewish world represented in Jewish teachings online. Let's see. Looking for more things. 3 Jews, 97 million opinions. I love that. That's quite possibly true. Kathy says we need more rabbi cowboys. That's true as well. If Abraham, a bowl of salad says, if Abraham, Moses, and the other biblical people were to be here today, they would probably think of Orthodox men and to be Reform and would not recognize an Orthodox temple. It could be saying you call that Jewish, or something like that. I may disagree on the maybe the direction that's going in the sense that Orthodox Jews today are practicing a kind of Judaism that seems so far removed from these guys for whom their primary way of talking to God was killing an animal in a building. Right? They're going to be like, "Where's your building? Where's your animal? What are you even doing?" There is a story of Rabbi Akiva. This is back. I think this is. I don't know if this is a midrash or it's in the time of the Talmud, but there's a story of Rabbi Akiva. Great rabbi of the early, classical period, appears in the Mishnah and was killed by the Romans when the Romans were squashing the Judean part of their empire. But there's a story of Rabbi Akiva in Olam Haba, in heaven, being brought back to sit in the back of a bait. No, I may be getting this story wrong. This may be Moses. I think it's a story about Moses. So I should really look this up. So anyway, one of our patriarchs, let's say Moses, is brought back to life, or at least in kind of It's a Wonderful Life sort of situation. Nobody else could see him, but he's sitting in the back of a Beit Midrash. And can't understand anything that people are saying. Literally, they're speaking a different language, right? Moses, at least according to the Torah, was speaking Hebrew. The rabbis of our tradition largely taught and spoke in Aramaic, because that was the lingua franca of the time and the place. And Moses literally can't understand what's going on. But he's catching bits here and there. Some of the words are similar, but until he hears a story, he hears like a student raising a question and saying, "Hey, Rabbi, why do the Torah letters, if you've ever seen a Torah scroll up close, you'll see the letters have a little bit of a scribal stylism to them. They're little crowns on the things. The letters look like they have crowns on them because they're little lines that come out from the top." And the student says to the rabbi, "Rabbi, why are there these little crowns on top? That just seems like a flourish. It doesn't seem to make any sense." And with Moses sitting in the back of the room, the rabbi says, "Those crowns are there to teach a lesson that goes all the way back to Moses at Sinai." And then Moses feels a little better at that point, right? If you pick any Jewish leader, teacher, patriarch, matriarch from history and plop them down into the Jewish world, they're going to see something vastly different from what they were accustomed to. And yet there will be these little insights, these little moments that connect our people throughout time, right? And in my part of my career of leading a synagogue and leading services and things like that, I was having trouble because I learned how to lead services in a traditional way. I went to a community where not a lot of people were interested in services in a traditional way. And I went to my teacher. I said, I spent 5 years in seminary. I'd just gotten good at leading prayers in the traditional way, and nobody's interested. What am I doing wrong? And my rabbi said to me, I want you to imagine Rebbe Akiva, sage of the Talmud, traveling through time, popping up on Pico Robertson Boulevard, going into a particular synagogue there, a conservative synagogue there, and walking in and observing the service. What do you think he'd say? And I was at a complete loss. I had no idea what Rebbe Akiva would say. But he said, Rebbe Akiva would be furious. Not because there'd been such drift, not because it was so different. Rebbe Akiva would be furious because he would look at the crowd, he would look at the davening and the Torah reading and all these things that they were doing, and he would say, you guys, me and my buddies invented this way of doing Jewish 2,000 years ago because we had a crisis. We just lost the temple. We thought, what are we going to, we were in a panic. What are we going to do now? Let's institute prayer and study instead of sacrifices. Right? We had a crisis. We met that crisis by changing how people did Judaism. Are you telling me that in 2,000 years, the Jewish people has not had another crisis that would have engendered a different way of doing things? And my rabbi's point was not that we are changing too fast, but perhaps we aren't changing enough. And I'm not saying not being Jewish anymore. I'm just saying not being real with people's expectations, needs, and doing Jewish in ways that meets those needs rather than encouraging people to do Jewish the way we think it should be done. And so I haven't shared that with this group before, but I wanted to share that with you just to say that sometimes doing things the old way is not doing a better job of meeting people's needs. Sometimes changing isn't an assimilationist move. It is a way of stopping or stemming the tide of people losing their Jewish identity. And those are a couple of lessons that I wanted to get across today. We've just been going, we've been going for about an hour and 20 minutes now. I really need to stop to prepare for my next lesson today, but I really hope that this has been educational for people. I always enjoy talking to this crowd. I've seen a lot of familiar faces, a lot of familiar names and handles. I have seen some new handles today, Bionic Magi and a bowl of salad, and thank you, Rachel, for coming in at a different account, so I would stop calling you Bionic Magi, so I'll stop doing that right now. But listen, this has been a wonderful discussion for me. If I haven't answered your questions yet, I really apologize. Feel free to ask those questions in the comments below this video so that I will see them and come back to them. If you're watching this on the replay, please feel free to put your comments, thoughts, etc. in the comment section. If you liked this video, if you liked this discussion, please do me a solid and give this video a thumbs up. Press that little button there underneath the video. Give it a thumbs up so that I know that we're kind of on the right track, so that other people who need to learn this can find this. And once again, I'm just super grateful that people showed up to learn with me this morning. This is my favorite thing to do in the world. And I'm just really honored to have students and fellow Jews and Jew-curious people to learn with. I'm having the time of my life. So thank you for joining me today. And until next time, heroes, peace.